Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we start, as we always like to whenever we can, with some good news. The thing is, it has long since been clear that there can be a price to be paid for criticism of Israeli policies toward the Palestinians. The recent firing of AP correspondent Emily Wilder after the right wing got all hot and bothered over some pro-Palestinian social media posts that she put up before she became an employee of AP. The fact that those got her fired, it's just the latest example. One particular target of, we'll call it a suppressionist effort, has been the BDS movement, where BDS stands for Boycott, Divest, Sanction. It looks to put economic sanctions on Israel because, again, of its treatment of the Palestinians. But pushed by pro-Israeli politicians and lobbyists, legislatures in 35 states have passed laws targeting that movement, the most recent two coming in April, usually by banning or sharply restricting doing any state business with any company or occasionally any individual supporting or engaging in a boycott of Israel. And what's more, demanding that any contractor with the state sign a pledge saying that they are not and will not boycott Israel. Now, the fact that this seems transparently, obviously unconstitutional, that it is, in fact, using government power to economically punish political speech, that hasn't been a deterrent so far. So it's good news that there is another voice that can be added here. On May 21st, U.S. District Court Judge Mark Cohen smacked down Georgia's anti-BDS law as unconstitutional, ruling not only that it impermissibly burdens the right of free speech, but also that it is unconstitutional compelled speech. That is, it not only said you can't say A, but by requiring you to sign a pledge to that effect says you must say B. The case here involved one Abby Martin, an American journalist and filmmaker who was critical of Israeli policies. She had been invited to a paid speaking engagement at Georgia Southern University, but it was canceled when she refused to sign a pledge that she was not engaged in a boycott of Israel. So she sued, and now she has won. And that should be good news and is good news to any actual supporter of free speech. Cases about these anti-BDS laws have now arisen in 5 states: Arizona, Arkansas, Kansas, Texas, and now Georgia. While 2 of those earlier cases, the decision was vacated because subsequent changes to the law rendered the case moot. The good fact is that in all 5 of these cases, these anti-BDS laws lost. And yeah, that is good news. It also brings us to our main story, a longer look at Israel and the Palestinians. Because there's another ceasefire, as we call it now, ceasefire in the region, although ceasefire just really means there's no overt violence. There are no rockets being fired, no bombs falling, no precision-guided munitions, no exchange of gunfire, none of any of that. But it doesn't change the fact that the invisible violence of oppression, denial of rights, discrimination, and apartheid continue. Now, the issue here is too big for me to try to actually cover myself, especially in one show. And people have written they've written a whole series of books about this conflict over the decades. But what I am going to do is make several statements, or you can call them observations, you can call them charges, you can call them claims, call them anything you want. But what they amount to is a number of unpleasant truths for Americans. First, what just happened, this latest outbreak of overt violence, may seem like just another in the cycles of such violence, of cycles marked by claim versus counterclaim versus counterclaim versus counterclaim, with everyone on every side always claiming that they are the victimized innocents and their opponents are the venal infidels. And in some of these cases, in fact, in a lot of them, it's hard to see the source. It's hard to see the immediate spark, what actually sparked this particular round. But this time it's not. This time, we know what started the latest round. We know who was the one who poured gasoline on the always smoldering embers. We know who threw the match. We know who threw the first punch. Nearly 7 million Israelis and an equal number of Palestinians live in the land marked on the west by the Mediterranean Sea and on the east by the Jordan River. This is the land that encompasses Israel plus the occupied territories of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. It is also an area in which Israeli authorities, Israeli policies, the Israeli military are the power. As Human Rights Watch said in its sadly undernoted report on Israeli apartheid, the expression of that power includes a pattern of methodically privileging Israeli Jews and discriminating against Palestinians. Quoting the report, laws, policies, and statements by leading Israeli officials make plain that the objective is maintaining Jewish Israeli control over demographics, political power, and land. In pursuit of this goal, authorities have dispossessed, confined, forcibly separated, and subjugated Palestinians by virtue of their identity. And part of that maintaining of control over demographics, power, and land has been an ongoing drive by Israel to drive Palestinians in East Jerusalem into ghettos, or actually to drive them out of East Jerusalem entirely, for the overt purpose of providing more room for Jewish residents in that part of the city. It is the Judaization of East Jerusalem. And that is what started this latest cycle of bloodshed. Human rights experts have identified the pending forced eviction of Palestinian families in the Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan neighborhoods of East Jerusalem as the spark that set off the conflict. S. Michael Link, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and Balakrishnan Rajagopal, UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, writing for the UN Human Rights Office, the High Commissioner, said on May 11th, quoting, "The immediate source of the current tensions in East Jerusalem is the actions of Israeli settler organizations, whose stated aim is to turn Palestinian neighborhoods into Jewish neighborhoods, an intention," they actively said, actively abetted by the city government of Jerusalem, and which in fact is in line with state policy of Israel. That's how this started, and don't let anybody tell you different. These threatened evictions came at the end of a month marked by Israeli authorities blocking access to the important Damascus Gate Plaza for the first 12 days of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. A march on April 25th through Jerusalem by an extreme right ultra-nationalist Jewish group chanting "Death to Arabs" and attacking Palestinian passers-by. And on May 7th, Israeli security forces firing rubber bullets, tear gas, and stun grenades at worshippers gathered at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is part of Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Enclosure, which is the third holiest site in all of Islam and is the place where Muslims believe Muhammad physically ascended to heaven. Hamas responded to what Muslims regarded as a desecration of the mosque by firing a barrage of rockets from Gaza into Israel, which Israel then used as an excuse for day upon day of bombing of Gaza, until 11 days later it finally stopped, for now, with something, and you wouldn't know this. You wouldn't know this unless you kind of dug deep into news reports about the events, with 12 Israelis dead and over 20 times that many Palestinians dead and nearly 15 times as many Palestinians as Israelis wounded. The UN estimated that nearly 77,000 Palestinians have been displaced by Israeli airstrikes. Nearly 1,000 buildings and homes have been destroyed, damaged, or rendered uninhabitable, and at least 19 healthcare facilities were damaged or destroyed. And Oxfam is now saying that because of Israeli bombing of desalination plants, 400,000 people in Gaza now lack safe drinking water. So yes, people on both sides suffered. People on both sides died. But don't for a second there is anything approaching the sort of, for lack of a better term, balance that the description both sides invites you to imagine. Don't for a second imagine that the Israeli response was in any way proportional, and don't imagine for a second that these airstrikes, Israeli airstrikes, were anywhere near as surgical as we've been told, unless, that is, you want to say Israel intended to bomb homes, healthcare facilities, and water supplies. And there's another potential cause for this violence that you should know about. Because this also came at a time when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, or Netanyahu as I like to call him, time when Netanyahu was trying to stay in power even as he faces criminal charges of corruption. Israel has held 4 parliamentary elections in the last 2 years, all of them inconclusive, because no one has been able to put together a governing coalition in the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, which you probably knew, but just in case you didn't. I think as a result of each of these elections, each of these inconclusive elections, has been that Netanyahu has stayed on as a caretaker prime minister. Which does raise the question of how much of the provocations that have been involved, provocations such as blocking the Damascus Gate, and once cutting power to loudspeakers broadcasting prayers to worshipers gathered at Al-Aqsa. How much of these were the result of blissful ignorance of how tense things were getting, and how much of them were because of a full awareness of exactly that? In light of the facts that one effect of this has been to deal a blow to opponents of Netanyahu trying to unseat him, one of who just gave up efforts to form a coalition government, and the fact that Anshel Pfeffer, a political commentator and a biography of Netanyahu, has said that he has, quote, stoked and exploited these tensions for political gain time and again, that is a reasonable question. It's especially reasonable in the light of some history, and I don't mean biblical history. I don't mean even how the West exploited and lied to both the Arabs and the Jews with false promises around the time of World War I. I don't mean any of that. I mean just history of the past 20 years. So, appropriately, let's start in 2000. Bill Clinton wanted a meeting of himself, Yasser Arafat, head of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Arafat didn't want to attend, thinking that nothing would be accomplished and that a failure to make progress would be worse than no meeting at all. Clinton convinced Arafat to attend by telling him there would be no recriminations. At that meeting, Barak made a supposedly what was labeled a generous offer to Arafat, involving a Palestinian state in Gaza and something like 90% of the West Bank. Arafat refused. The talks broke down. Clinton denounced Arafat for the failure, betraying the promise he had given him about no recriminations, and giving credence to the idea that Arafat didn't want to negotiate. There's just one problem. The deal that Barak proposed was one that the Israelis knew in advance that Arafat would not, could not accept. It was nothing but a propaganda ploy designed to head off the possibility of any settlement. So what was wrong with this so-called generous offer? Well, for one thing, the 10% of the West Bank that was not to be part of this Palestinian state would consist of Israeli security corridors connecting military outposts and settlements, which would have sliced the West Bank to a series of Bantustans, with Palestinians needing permission of the Israeli military to get from one part of their own country to another. Another, probably even more important issue was that of the right of return. That is the dream of the families of those who lost or fled their land during their homes during the 1948 war to return to them someday. This is an intensely emotional issue among Palestinians. And the Israelis knew, they knew because their own analysts told them, that if Israel accepted this right of return in principle, that its application could be limited and that the PLO would be okay with that. But instead, this generous offer actually required the Palestinians to entirely relinquish any right of return in perpetuity. No Palestinian leader could have accepted that and survived politically and maybe even physically. and the Israelis knew it. This generous offer was made with the intent that it be rejected, with the intent to undermine negotiations toward a final agreement, with the intent of justifying refusing to continue to talk. Now, by the way, before I move on, speaking of that right of return, go back for a minute to those families to be dispossessed in East Jerusalem. A 1950 Israeli law specifically bans any Palestinian who fled or lost their land in the 1948 war to reclaim those lands. Meanwhile, a 1970 law specifically empowers any Israeli Jew to reclaim any land their family fled or lost during that same war. So what happens is that an Israeli Jew goes to court and says, hey, my family lived on that spot in East Jerusalem 50-something years ago, and the court goes, oh, so you did. Okay, well, in that case, the land is yours, and the Palestinians on it, well, they'll just have to move. Couple that with the fact that it is almost impossible for a Palestinian in East Jerusalem to get a permit to build a house. Between 2014 and 2016, 98.6% of all such applications were denied. And you have the elements for repeated land grabs and dispossession of an occupied population. All right, getting back to the history. Move ahead 5 years. There are two major political alignments among Palestinians, Hamas and Fatah. In 2005 and 2006, the Palestinian Authority held a series of elections in the West Bank and Gaza for offices ranging from local council to the presidency. Israel and the U.S. have been demanding such elections take place as a precondition to continued talks because they believe that Fatah, which they thought had become sufficiently malleable, they thought that Fatah would win. But when the results were counted, the results from the U.S.-Israeli point of view were not good. Hamas actually did quite well, even winning a majority of seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council. In March of 2007, after months of painful, detailed negotiations, Hamas and Fatah announced the formation of a coalition government. The U.S. and Israel, then under the Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, flatly refused to deal with that government. In fact, they declared that even before the government was formed. They demanded Hamas be kicked out of it. They declared they would not deal with any government of which Hamas was part. Remember, this was a government that came into existence as the result of elections which the U.S. and Israel demanded. But they didn't care. The results weren't what they wanted. Their side didn't win, so elections be damned. It was that refusal that led to the breakdown of this coalition government and the Palestinian civil war, the end result of which was that Hamas got forced out of the West Bank and Fatah got forced out of Gaza, which is why Hamas is now in control in Gaza, and Fatah, as the Palestinian Authority, has whatever limited control over whatever limited parts of the West Bank that Israel chooses to allow. Okay, now jump ahead to 2014, which is when Hamas and the Palestinian Authority reached a new unity agreement, following which a new government of technocrats was installed on June 2nd of that year. Now, note well, this new Palestinian government did not include any members of Hamas. In fact, it didn't include any members of any Palestinian partisan organization. It was mostly made up of technocrats and was designed that way consciously and on purpose. Hamas supported this government as part of an effort to end the long-standing alienation between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. But the reaction by Israel was that Israel, under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, broke off talks with the Palestinian Authority, with Israel saying that they would return to the talks only after the Palestinian Authority broke all contacts with Hamas. So in 2007, the elected Palestinian government was unacceptable because Hamas was in it. In 2014, it was unacceptable even though Hamas was not in it. The simple fact that Hamas even supported the government made it, in the words of Israel's then housing minister Uri Ariel, the Palestinian terror government. as Uriel made, in his words, the appropriate Zionist response of announcing plans for 1,000 additional Jewish homes in East Jerusalem. It was that rejection of this agreement that finally moved me, finally pushed me, even against my will, finally required me to say very clearly, as I did in July 2014, I'm quoting myself here, Israel does not want peace. Israel prefers the status quo. Israel prefers having Hamas as an excuse to avoid a final settlement. Israel prefers the occasional Hamas rocket, most of which really don't do any harm at all. It prefers that to having no rockets at all. It prefers to drive the people of Gaza into the arms of Hamas to do anything, preferring that to doing anything would undermine Hamas's popularity, such as lifting the blockade of Gaza, which has turned it into the world's largest outdoor prison, which, by the way, it still is today. Now, why would they do this? Again, I'm quoting myself here, because real peace would mean a real Palestinian state, and that would require the hard right of Israel to give up its dreams of a greater Israel, a nation standing astride the Middle East with the power and reach of King David in all his glory and the most grandiose of tellings of the tales. I'm going to interrupt for the moment to say, if you think that's over the top, you think I went too far there, let me tell you something. My feelings about the Middle East, my feelings about Israel and the Palestinians began to change when I learned that the slogan of Likud, which is the political bloc, it's Netanyahu's party, that the slogan of Likud translated to both sides of the Jordan, which would mean including not only Israel and the occupied territories, but also a good hunk of present-day Jordan. Anyway, back to quoting myself. A real peace would mean treating Palestinians as equals and Israelis viewing themselves as one among equals. And for too many among the Israeli right, the politically powerful Israeli right, the politically powerful, religiously conservative Israeli right, that simply can't be tolerated. In the not quite 7 years since that time, I've been given no reason to change that assessment. And if I was ever tempted to change that assessment, here's something that would have stopped me. It's about Hamas. Not that Hamas is engaged in active terrorism. That's well established. It's beyond question. Not that Hamas has committed crimes and war crimes against Israeli civilians. That's also beyond question. But it's rather that Hamas, which actually is an Arabic acronym for Islamic Resistance Movement, would probably not exist today were it not for the assistance of Israel. That in the late 1970s, Israel helped turn a bunch of fringe Palestinian Islamists into one of the world's most notorious militant groups. Brigadier General Yitzhak Segev was the Israeli military governor in Gaza in the early 1980s. He told a New York Times reporter that he had helped finance the Palestinian Islamist movement as a counterweight to the secularists and socialists of Fatah. The Israeli government gave me a budget, and the military government gave to the mosques. Colonel David Hakim, an Arab affairs expert for the Israeli military who was based in Gaza in the late 1980s, said the support of Gaza was original sin. Avner Cohen, a former Israeli religious affairs official in the mid-1980s, has said, Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation, recalling how he wrote an official report to his superiors warning him not to play divide and conquer in the occupied territories precisely because of concern about blowback. Now, Hakim said at this time, nobody was actually thinking about the consequences. But considering how useful Hamas has been as a boogeyman and how ready various Israeli governments have been to use its very existence to reject any possibility for a different path, it becomes difficult to accept a claim of foolish ignorance as a full answer. It's come down to this. How many times can Israeli governments refuse to take opportunities to move to a real agreement? How many times can they try to undermine any sign of moderation among Palestinian militants, any sign of willingness for a reasonable agreement? How clear do they have to make it that the only thing Palestinians could say could be resurrender, and the only thing they could do would be disappear? Those are the only things that would be acceptable to them. How long does it have to go on before we accept the fact that despite the near constant repetition of the mantra that Israel has the right to defend itself, that Israel is not facing an external adversary, but to paraphrase a Human Rights Watch, Israel is facing a Palestinian resistance to being dispossessed, confined, forcibly separated, and subjugated, that Israel is not engaging in self-defense, but engaging in maintaining occupation, and maintaining dominance, and maintaining power, even an expanding empire, and that U.S. policy is actively abetting that to the tune of $3.8 billion in military aid every year, an amount equal to 1/5 of Israel's entire military budget and 3/5 of the United States' entire foreign military aid. Now, things are changing. The iron grip Israeli policy has on U.S. foreign policy has been loosening. It's getting rusty, and questions and doubts are being raised. And I would love to go into that, but I literally don't have time, so I'm going to have to try to touch on it some next week. But for now, I'll just say that U.S. policy toward Israel should be based on the idea that while we may not be able to truly stay the hangman's hand, we can at least stop helping provide the rope. And after all that, we're going to end with this footnote. According to preliminary data from the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism, anti-Semitic incidents in the United States have increased 68% since the latest military conflict broke out early in May. Incidents such as verbal or physical attacks on targeting Jews and vandalism at synagogues have increased each week through the month of May. The ADL has also reported a spike in anti-Semitic language on Twitter, finding more than 17,000 tweets in 1 week in mid-May, using variations of the phrase, "Hitler was right." Okay. The equation of criticism of Israeli government policies with anti-Semitism is crap. It's a political smear intended to suppress opposition to those policies. But that does not change the fact that anti-Semitism is very, very real. And just as we cannot allow ourselves to be silenced by the smear, we cannot allow ourselves to stand silent in the face of the real thing. That's it. I'm done. We're out of here. We will see you in 2 weeks. Until then, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And as always, shalom.